The parachutes were the problem. Commander Paul Milius knew it before he crossed into Laos, and he flew the run anyway. His aircraft was a patrol bomber built to hunt Soviet submarines over open ocean. Someone had stripped it, armored its belly, painted it jungle green, and bolted a World War II bomb sight into the nose. It was called an OP-2E. The men who flew it called their squadron the Ghost Squadron because officially it did not exist. It was February 27, 1968. The call sign was Sophomore 50. Below it lay a corridor of limestone karst and triple canopy jungle in the Laotian panhandle, a place with no American ground troops, no American flag, and no acknowledged American war. Milius was there to drop listening devices into the trees. The devices came down on white silk parachutes. That was the flaw. A seismic sensor could be buried by the force of its own fall, leaving nothing above ground but an antenna shaped like a weed. An acoustic sensor could not. It had to hang in the canopy to hear, and to hang in the canopy, it needed a chute, and a chute meant a bright white marker swinging in the green, visible from the ground, telling anyone below exactly where the machine was and roughly how much it was worth. To place them accurately, Milius had to fly low, straight and slow. 500 feet. No jinking, no evasive turns. The bomb sight demanded a stable run, and a stable run over a valley ringed with 37mm anti-aircraft guns was a mathematical problem with only one variable, which was time. His crew numbered 9. The citation for what followed records that the aircraft took multiple hits from 37mm anti-aircraft fire during a run over the target. Petty Officer Second Class John Hartzheim was mortally wounded and could not get out. The last his shipmates saw of him. He was still inside, not moving. Fire moved through the airframe. Milius held the aircraft level, gave the order to abandon it, and stayed at the controls, while 7 men went out through the hatches into the trees. He was the last one out. Rescue helicopters pulled 7 survivors from the jungle over the following hours. They did not find Milius. They never found Milius. Across the Mekong, in an air-conditioned building in Thailand, 2 computers were waiting for the signals his sensors would send. That was the point of the whole thing. Every man his squadron lost, and it lost 20 in 8 months, was spent to plant a machine in a jungle so that a room full of analysts could hear a truck. The road below was the reason. It ran from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, and along it moved the fuel, ammunition, rice and reinforcements that sustained the war in the South. Cut it, the war in the South starved. That was the theory. Nobody had ever cut it. Before we go any further, I want to say something directly to you. Cold War Impact is a small channel. I research and write these documentaries myself, and the reach on recent videos has fallen sharply. If you find this kind of history worth your time, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and pass the video to someone else who cares about this period. It costs you nothing, and it decides whether the channel keeps going. Thank you. Now back to Laos. For 7 years, the United States tried to close the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the air. It flew roughly 426,000 fighter-bomber sorties over the southern Laotian corridor alone, plus about 30,000 heavy bomber sorties. In 1969 alone, it put 433,000 tons of ordnance into that country. It lost 497 fixed-wing aircraft and more than 200 helicopters over that country. None of it closed the road. Then in the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese army came south in tanks, not squads, not porters, armored divisions, on roads, in daylight. Every vehicle in that invasion had come down the corridor, past the sensors, past the gunships, past the most sophisticated surveillance system anyone had ever built. The answer to the trail was not a bomb, not a blockade, and not an invasion. It was a machine that listened. It was built. It worked. It did exactly what its designers promised it would do, and it still failed. And understanding why is the most uncomfortable lesson the United States took out of Southeast Asia. But to see how a country tried to solve a jungle with a computer, you have to go back to a summer school for girls in Massachusetts. In 1966, where 47 scientists spent their vacation deciding that the bombing campaign then underway was worthless. The idea did not begin in the Pentagon. It began with a law professor. In January 1966, Roger Fisher of Harvard Law School, working part-time as a consultant to Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, proposed a physical barrier across the neck of Vietnam. Minefields, wire, ditches, cleared ground, and strong points. Roughly 160 miles of it. A month earlier, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had already met twice with Carl Kaysen, a former National Security Council staffer who had suggested something similar built out of electronics rather than Earth. McNamara did not send the idea to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He sent it to the JASON division of the Institute for Defense Analyses, a standing group of elite academic scientists who advised the Defense Department. 47 of them assembled in the summer of 1966 at Dana Hall, a girls' preparatory school in Wellesley, Massachusetts, chosen because it was close to Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and because it was empty over the summer. The buildings were guarded day and night. Everyone present held a top-secret clearance. The names attached to the effort included Kaysen, Fisher, George Kistiakowsky, and Jerome Wiesner, men who between them covered the Manhattan Project and 2 presidential science advisory posts. They delivered their report to McNamara on August 30, 1966. It was blunt to the point of insult. The strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam, then in its second year, had produced, in their words, no measurable direct effect on Hanoi's ability to mount and support military operations in the South. Dropping more bombs on the same country was not going to work. What they proposed instead was 2 barriers. One would run below the demilitarized zone to stop men on foot. The other, far more radical, would hang over the Laotian panhandle. It would consist of air-delivered mines and battery-powered sensors, seeded from aircraft, listening for engines, with the take relayed to a central point where it would be turned into targets. In an October 1966 memorandum to President Johnson, McNamara described it as a line that would lie near the 17th parallel, run from the sea across the neck of South Vietnam, and continue across the trails in Laos. The press learned enough to name it. They called it the McNamara Line, McNamara's Wall, and the Electric Fence. Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri called it a billion-dollar Maginot Line concept, which was meant as an insult and turned out to be a fair description of the budget, if not the outcome. On September 15, 1966, McNamara created an organization to build it. He named it the Defense Communications Planning Group, a title so boring it was designed to attract no attention whatsoever and put Army Lieutenant General Alfred Dodd Starbird in charge. Starbird reported directly to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His deadline was roughly 1 year. President Johnson authorized construction on January 13, 1967. The program then changed its name repeatedly, partly for security and partly because it kept changing shape. It was Practice 9, then Illinois City, then Dimarca. The air-supported portion over Laos was split off and renamed Muscle Shoals in September 1967. On June 1, 1968, Muscle Shoals became Igloo White, and that is the name history kept. The uniformed services hated it. The Joint Chiefs argued that a fixed barrier would demand troop numbers nobody had. General William Westmoreland had no enthusiasm for static defense. The Marine Corps, which was handed the job of building and manning the ground portion below the demilitarized zone, objected hardest of all, because it was the Marines who would have to stand on it. Marine engineers cleared a strip of ground between the outposts at Gio Linh and Con Thien, roughly 600 meters wide and 11 kilometers long, and called it the Trace. By the autumn of 1967, more than 7,000 Marines were committed to the barrier project. General Lewis Walt warned that the manpower requirement would end offensive operations in the north of South Vietnam altogether. Years later, General Robert Cushman described the concept in a single word. He called it stupid. Then, in the opening weeks of 1968, the North Vietnamese overran the Special Forces camp at Lang Vây using armor and laid siege to the Marine base at Khe Sanh. The idea of a thin static line held by infantry died in those weeks. The ground barrier was quietly abandoned. What survived was the half that never needed a soldier to stand on it. The electronic half. The half over Laos. And here is the detail that would define everything that followed. The scientists at Dana Hall had promised a system that would detect movement. They had not promised that detecting movement would stop it. Nobody in the chain of command ever asked them to. The other side had a name, a commander, and a doctrine, and every one of them deserves to be understood, because the trail was not a road. It was an institution. The organization that ran it was Group 559, established on May 19, 1959, and named for the month and year of its founding. In its first years, it was a footpath operation. Men carried loads on their backs and on reinforced bicycles and moved at the speed of a walking man. By April 1965, it had grown to about 24,000 personnel under General Phan Trong Chu, organized into truck battalions, bicycle battalions, a boat battalion, 8 engineer battalions, and 45 liaison stations. Its motto was direct: build roads to advance, fight the enemy to travel. Command passed to Hang Van Thai at the end of that year, and then in 1967 to Senior Colonel Dong Si Nguyen, later a lieutenant general, and it was under him that the trail became something the United States had no vocabulary for. By 1970, the group had been elevated to the status of a military region in its own right, informally the Trong Son Army. By July 1971, it fielded 5 divisional headquarters, 4 truck transport regiments, 2 pipeline regiments, 3 anti-aircraft artillery regiments, 8 engineer regiments, and an infantry division of its own. The physical scale takes some absorbing. In 1966, American intelligence estimated the North Vietnamese had roughly 1,000 kilometers of usable road in the corridor, of which perhaps 300 were passable all year. By 1967, the North Vietnamese had built 2,959 kilometers of vehicle-capable road. Vietnamese official sources state that Group 559 eventually constructed a strategic route network of about 20,000 kilometers, with 5 longitudinal axes and 21 transverse connectors. Western estimates of the final network run from 12,000 miles upward. The figures differ, and I am giving you both, but they agree on the essential point: this was not a trail. It was a national infrastructure project executed under bombardment. Manpower grew from 24,000 to well over 100,000. Tens of thousands of Laotians labored on it, many of them pressed into the work. The Than Ninh Song Phong, the youth shot brigades, provided a large share of the labor force, and a very large proportion of them were teenage girls. They filled craters, cut roadbed, guided trucks by hand, and died in numbers nobody has ever fully counted. The logistics method was relay, not through movement. The route was divided into sectors, each controlled by a bin tram, a way station of roughly regimental size with its own engineers, anti-aircraft guns, storage and repair facilities. A truck did not drive from North Vietnam to the battlefield. It drove one leg, offloaded, and turned around, and a fresh truck carried the cargo forward the next night. Drivers learned one stretch of road in extraordinary detail and drove it in the dark for months. By the end of 1970, the group ran 27 binge trams, moved roughly 40,000 tons, and reported cargo losses of about 3.4%. They defended it. By the close of the American interdiction campaign, the corridor was covered by something on the order of 1,500 anti-aircraft guns, radar-directed 37 and 57 mm pieces, backed later by 85 and 100 mm weapons, with far larger numbers of heavy machine guns and automatic cannon underneath them, and eventually surface-to-air missiles and shoulder-fired infrared missiles as well. Dummy gun positions were built at a ratio of as many as 4 fakes to 1 real weapon. They also built a pipeline. American intelligence detected it late in 1968, running southwest from Vinh. It grew into multiple parallel lines, the largest around 8 inches across, hand-laid, buried, repaired continuously, and by Vietnamese account exceeding 1,400 kilometers. Fuel that had once ridden in drums on trucks now flowed underground, invisible to a microphone. Everything entering the corridor from North Vietnam had to squeeze through a handful of mountain passes, and the Americans knew it. The heaviest used was the Mu Gear Pass, bombed so relentlessly that it acquired, somewhere in the retelling, the nickname the Door of Death. South of it lay the Ban Karai Pass, and south of that, the ban raving. These were the closest thing the trail had to a bottleneck, and they were struck year after year, and the traffic kept coming through, because a pass that has been cratered is still a pass, and a crater can be filled by people with shovels in a single night. What actually reached the battlefield is one of the most disputed figures in the entire war. The Central Intelligence Agency estimated that between 1966 and 1971, the North sent more than 630,000 troops down the corridor, along with 100,000 tons of food, 400,000 weapons, and 50,000 tons of ammunition. Across the war as a whole, something like 1.75 million tons of supplies and about 1 million soldiers traveled it. American commanders claimed at the time that roughly 80% of the material entering the corridor was destroyed before it arrived. The Vietnamese claimed losses of about 15%. Thomas Thayer, an analyst working for the Defense Department's research agency, reached a third answer that satisfied nobody. He concluded that only a small fraction of everything imported into North Vietnam was ever pushed south in the first place, and that more than 2/3 of what was pushed south got where it was going. 3 numbers, 3 institutions, 1 road. Keep that disagreement in mind, because it is about to become the central problem of the entire campaign. Dong Si Nguyen's assumption was simple. The Americans could destroy any single point on the network at any time and could not destroy the network. He was correct, and the system being assembled to prove him wrong was already under construction on the far bank of the Mekong. The engineering was genuinely brilliant. I want to be clear about that before anything else, because the failure to come was not a failure of invention. The sensors came out of anti-submarine warfare. For 20 years, the United States Navy had been dropping sonobuoys into the ocean to listen for propellers, and the basic package, a battery, a transducer, a low-power radio transmitter, and a float, adapted to land with remarkably little modification. The Navy kept the naming convention. The acoustic land version was the Aku buoy, the seismic version was the spike buoy, the workhorse was the air-delivered seismic intrusion detector, known as the ADSID. It was about 31 inches long and weighed roughly 25 pounds, shaped like a dart. Dropped from altitude, it drove itself into the earth on impact and buried everything except an antenna molded to look like a jungle plant. Underground, a geophone waited for the ground tremor of an engine. The Aku buoy hung instead. It weighed about 26 pounds, came down on a parachute, and lodged in the canopy where a microphone could pick up sound. Combined units called ACOUSAD carried both a geophone and a microphone, which meant an analyst in Thailand could put on headphones and listen live to a valley in Laos. Transmission power was low, about 2 watts, in the sonobuoy radio band. Low power meant a signal difficult to detect from the ground and useless over distance, so relay aircraft orbited above the corridor, continuously catching the sensor transmissions and passing them east. Those relay aircraft were a story in themselves. The first of them were converted long-range radar aircraft, 4-engine machines carrying an enormous radome, flying from Korat in Thailand under the code name Batcat. They held long orbits over hostile territory, doing nothing but listening to sensors and rebroadcasting what they heard, which combined tedium and exposure in a way few other flying jobs managed. The replacement was stranger still. It was a modified single-engine, civilian light aircraft, a beach design fitted with a turbocharged engine and relay equipment, designated QU-22B and named Pave Eagle. It had been built to fly the mission with nobody on board. The remote control equipment existed, and the concept was sound, and in practice, the Air Force never once flew it operationally without a pilot in the seat. So a single American sat alone in a converted private aircraft, at high altitude over Laos, at night, in an airframe that suffered persistent mechanical trouble, listening to a jungle. The program was cancelled in 1972. There were stranger devices. Chemical detectors, the so-called people sniffers, were built to register ammonia and the condensation nuclei given off by human sweat and cooking fires. The man-packed version weighed about 24 pounds and drew its air sample through an intake clamped to a rifle barrel, which produced the inevitable result that the machine's most reliable detection was the man carrying it. A helicopter-mounted version was flown on missions, the Army codenamed Snoopy. And a chemist at Stanford University asked in 1967 to evaluate whether the thing actually worked, reported that its ammonia channel responded more or less at random. There was also a short-lived sensor, camouflaged to look like animal droppings, which had to be redesigned to resemble a piece of wood after somebody pointed out that there were no dogs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It is easy to laugh at that, and people did, but look at what the joke actually reveals. An organization capable of building a buried geophone that could pick an engine out of a rainstorm was simultaneously dropping devices, shaped like droppings, into a country where the animal that produced them did not live. Nobody had asked. The system was being designed by people who had never stood on the ground it was meant to cover, and it would be built, funded, and fought with by people in the same position. Not every sensor was dropped from an aircraft. Smaller hand-and-placed units existed, and some of them were carried into the corridor on foot by reconnaissance teams operating under the Military Assistance Command's Studies and Observations Group, the deniable organization that ran cross-border patrols into Laos. Think about what that job involved. A handful of men walk into a valley that the United States is bombing around the clock in a country where their government denies having anyone at all carrying a machine whose entire purpose is to summon an airstrike to the spot where they are standing. They plant it, they camouflage it, and they walk out, and if they are still within earshot when it does its job, that is their problem. Almost none of that work was acknowledged for decades either, and a good deal of it still has not been. The contractors were the industrial core of American electronics. Sandia, Texas Instruments, Magnavox, General Electric, Hazeltine. The sensors had to be delivered, and delivery was the killing part. Initially, the work fell to the Navy Squadron VO-67, flying 12 heavily modified patrol aircraft, and to Air Force helicopters. The squadron was commissioned on February 15, 1967, with 23 men on hand. Its aircraft were fitted with new radios, waist-mounted machine guns, underwing gun pods, belly armor, muffled exhausts, and refurbished Norden bomb sights from the Second World War. The Navy had to recall retired Norden technicians and locate a training film in the Smithsonian to teach a new generation how to use them. Roughly 300 men reached the base at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand on November 15, 1967. The first mission flew 10 days later. Their radio call sign was Sophomore. Their existence was classified, and their mission stayed classified until 1998. In 8 months, the squadron lost 3 aircraft and 20 men. On January 11, 1968, the squadron's executive officer and his crew were lost on an Igloo White drop, 9 men in all. On February 17, a second aircraft was hit at about 500 feet, its starboard engine burning. Its last transmission was that they were beaten up pretty badly. 9 more men died. 10 days after that came Milius. 25% of the aircraft and roughly 1 man in 15 of the squadron in 8 months. Naval planners noted afterward that this was about half the loss rate they had projected. They had expected it to be worse. The squadron flew its last sensor mission on June 25, 1968, and was disestablished 6 days later. Delivery passed to F-4 Phantoms of the 25th Tactical Fighter Squadron, which dropped sensors at around 500 feet and 550 knots, guided onto the exact spot by forward air controllers in light aircraft. It was still dangerous, it was survivable, and the sensors themselves had problems that no amount of courage fixed. Batteries died within weeks, so every string had to be reseeded again and again. Sensors were therefore dropped in groups of 5 or 6, on the assumption that at least 3 would survive to work. Seismic units picked up thunder, rain, wind, distant bombing, artillery, aircraft and animals. Hanging Akuboys was spotted and taken down. The first attempt to run the system in earnest also came far too early. In January 1968, with the barrier still in its test phase, sensors detected heavy North Vietnamese movement toward Khe Sanh, and the seeding effort was diverted to support the siege. Air planners have claimed ever since that sensor data was decisive there. A naval officer serving as an assistant target intelligence officer with the 26th Marines, Bernard Cole, later wrote that airdrop sensors were a primary source of targeting data for the defenders. Marine commanders claimed casualties would have doubled without them. Westmoreland himself asked what broke the North Vietnamese effort, credited the heavy bombers. I am going to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets repeated until it hardens. Sensors contributed real targeting information at Khe Sanh. They were not the reason the base held. The distinction matters, because the inflated version of Khe Sanh became the argument for everything that followed. By the end of 1968, the tools existed. The problem was that nobody had yet built the thing that would make sense of them, and that thing was not a weapon. It was a building. The Infiltration Surveillance Center sat at Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Force Base, 9 miles west of the town. On the Thai bank of the Mekong, airmen called the base Naked Fanny. They called the building Dutch Mill. Ground was broken in July 1967, and it was running by the end of that year. It covered roughly 200,000 square feet and was said to be the largest building in Southeast Asia. It was windowless, heavily air-conditioned, partially below ground, and protected by revetments. Entry was through airlocks that held it under positive pressure, so the red dust outside could not reach the machinery. About 400 people worked inside. The janitors were off-duty American airmen because nobody without a clearance was allowed near the floor. At its center were 2 computers, an IBM 360, Model 65, and its twin. They were, in the official history's phrase, the most powerful then available, and they had been flown to a riverbank in Thailand to count trucks. Analysts sat at screens in a darkened room. When a sensor string activated, the pattern arrived as a moving line of light, and the analyst annotated it with a light pen, calculating the direction, the speed, and the number of vehicles from the timing between sensors. The machine projected where the convoy would be in 10 minutes and in 20, and at which choke point it could be met. One American airman who saw the inside of it described stepping out of the jungle and into the building as stepping back into America, but an America 15 years ahead. He compared the display boards to the war room in a film, except in real time, in color, 3 stories tall, showing the whole of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The workflow was fast for its era and slow for its purpose. Sensor activates. Relay aircraft catches the transmission. Data reaches Task Force Alpha at Nakhon Phanom. Analysts confirm a moving target. The result goes to 7th Air Force Headquarters at Tan Son Nhat near Saigon, which holds strike authority. An airborne command and control aircraft routes strike aircraft to a forward air controller. The controller marks the target. The strike goes in. There were faster methods for the nights when there was no time for that chain. A technique called Commando Bolt was run from a cell inside Task Force Alpha itself. The corridor was divided into strike modules, each covered by 4 strings of 3 to 6 sensors, and each module was surveyed precisely in advance. When a convoy entered a module, the computer produced a predicted position at a predicted moment, and a strike aircraft navigating by long-range radio positioning was sent to release on those coordinates without ever seeing the target, without a flare, and without a forward air controller. In heavy weather, a ground radar site could direct the drop instead. Sit with that for a moment. By the end of the 1960s, American aircraft were bombing coordinates generated by a computer from the output of buried microphones at night, through cloud, at targets no human being had laid eyes on. The pilot's contribution was to be in the right cubic mile of sky at the right second and to press a button when told. An Air Force officer described the whole system to a defense journal in 1971 in a sentence that has outlived every official history of the program. "We wire the Ho Chi Minh Trail like a drugstore pinball machine," he said, "and we plug it in every night." The men who read the sensor strings were nicknamed the Pinball Wizards, and the name stuck, and it was affectionate, and it was also the most accurate description anyone produced of what was actually happening. A light moved across a board. Somebody scored. Task Force Alpha never commanded a single aircraft. It could see the war. It could not fight it. 7th Air Force retained control, and that division of authority was written into the system from the first day. Against this, the North Vietnamese deployed something the computers had no model for, which was imagination. They found the sensors. Recorded American radio intercepts, later reviewed by the United States Senate, captured a North Vietnamese non-commissioned officer ordering a soldier up a tree to retrieve a hanging akubuoy, mostly because the parachute silk was valuable. Another recording caught a crew felling a tree to reach a sensor, followed by a crash and screaming. Because it landed on them, they deceived the sensors. They played recordings of truck engines to draw strikes onto empty ground. They drove decoy vehicles down decoy roads. They herded animals through seismic fields. Where chemical sniffers were suspected, they hung buckets of urine in the trees, and American aircraft bombed the buckets. They defeated the censor's assumptions. Trucks drove at night with masked headlights, or with lamps slung low under the bumper. Road watchers, very often young women, stood at intervals along the route with field telephones and white-painted poles to guide drivers through the dark. Sections of road were roofed with living vines trained across bamboo frames, so that from above there was nothing but canopy. Bridges were built just below the surface of rivers, invisible from the air, drivable at speed. And when a route became too dangerous, they built another one. The trail literature describes an entirely new network, on the order of 1,000 kilometers, built for daylight movement and screened well enough that traffic could run in daytime, which the American system had been designed on the assumption nobody would ever do. The competition was not technology against primitivism. It was capital against labor, and labor had 100,000 pairs of hands and no deadline. Here is what the men flying over Laos in 1970 did not know, and what the analysts in the windowless building could not see on their screens. The system was extraordinarily good at detection and mediocre at destruction, and those are different problems. Detection is a physics question, and physics was on the American side. A truck engine makes noise and shakes the ground, and a buried geophone will find it. Destruction is a logistics question, and logistics favored the defender absolutely. Consider the arithmetic. The deployed network ran to some 20,000 sensors, replaced continuously as their batteries died, at a program cost of between $1 billion and $1.7 billion to design and build, plus about $1 billion every year to run. A truck, by contrast, cost the North Vietnamese nothing, because the Soviet Union and China gave them away. Between 4,500 and 8,000 trucks entered North Vietnam every year during the campaign. A destroyed truck was replaced by a phone call to Moscow. A destroyed sensor field had to be reflown by pilots at 500 feet over anti-aircraft guns. There is a further cost in that arithmetic, which the budget never captured, and it belongs to the men who worked the corridor at low level. The forward air controllers who marked targets along the trail flew from Nakhon Phanom under the call sign NAIL in twin-boomed observation aircraft, and later with laser designators fitted so that guided bombs could be walked onto a truck park. Others flew in Laos, under an arrangement so deniable it barely bears description. Known as Ravens, they wore civilian clothes, carried no military identification, flew unmarked light aircraft, and were administratively attached to a special operations wing that could disown them. There were never more than about 24 of them at any time. By their own association's accounting of the roughly 160 men who served in that role and its predecessor across the war, 24 were killed. Around 90% of their aircraft were hit at some point, and roughly 60% were shot down. What it cost to retrieve one of them is best shown by a single case. On December 5, 1969, a fighter crew was shot down about 20 miles south of the Mujia Pass while flying a mine-dropping mission for the Barrier program. The pilot, Captain Benjamin Danielson, and his backseater, Lieutenant Woodrow Bergeron, both reached the ground alive in a river valley crawling with North Vietnamese troops. Danielson was killed during the attempt to reach him. Bergeron evaded on foot and in the water for roughly 50 hours while 16 separate rescue attempts failed. He was finally hoisted out on the third day under the cover of 22 propeller-driven attack aircraft flying suppression around the pickup. 2 men on the ground, 3 days, and most of a wing committed to getting one of them back. That was the exchange rate for the human beings inside the machine. There was one weapon in the theater that closed the gap, and it deserves its own moment because it was the single most effective truck killer of the war. It was a cargo aircraft. The AC-130 gunship, called Spectre, flew from Ubon in Thailand with the 16th Special Operations Squadron. Enter. It circled a target in a pylon turn, guns pointed out of the left side, and it could hold that turn for hours. It carried low-light television, infrared, and, from late 1969, a sensor called Black Crow. Black Crow was the elegant answer. It did not look for heat or light or sound. It detected the faint electromagnetic pulse given off by the unshielded ignition coil of a running truck engine. Foliage does not block radio emissions. A truck hidden under a vine trellis in total darkness, with its lights off, was still, to Black Crow, a bright and moving object. The prototype arrived in theatre on November 27, 1969, carrying 40mm Bofors cannon and the new sensor suite. It was known then as Surprise Package. 2 years later, rebuilt to a further standard, it would be given the name Thor. Between that 1st November and April 1970, it was credited with destroying or damaging more than 800 trucks. The average for each of the other 7 gunships over the same months was 357. The North Vietnamese official history is unambiguous about which American weapon frightened them. It singles out the gunship as the most formidable adversary encountered on the trail, stating that it established control over and suppressed, to a certain extent, their nighttime supply operations. Their soldiers called it the evil bird. They also adapted to it quickly and expensively. Because the gunship had to fly a slow, predictable circle to keep its guns on target, it was the one American aircraft that could be engaged by a gun crew willing to wait. The North Vietnamese pushed radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery into the corridor and increased its use against the gunships several times over, and then brought missiles in behind it. The aircraft that had proved the whole concept, by then carrying the name Thor, was shot down over southern Laos on December 21, 1972, hit by 37mm fire at close to 8,000 feet. Its commander was Captain Harry Lagerwall. 16 men were aboard, 2 came home. Every advantage on that road had a shelf life, and the other side set the expiry date. So the pieces were now assembled. Sensors that could find trucks under any cover, a computer that could predict where they were going, a gunship that could kill them in the dark. Against them, a labor force that never ran out, an unlimited supply of replacement vehicles, and terrain that grew its cover back every wet season. Both sides were about to find out which of those things mattered more, and the answer arrived over the course of a single night in March of 1971. By then, the clock was running on the American side and not on the Vietnamese one. President Nixon had begun withdrawing ground forces in 1969, and the withdrawal did not pause for the trail. American troop strength in South Vietnam fell year on year while the sensor campaign expanded, which meant the machine was being asked to do more precisely as the force behind it shrank. Air power was the last instrument left in the theatre, and interdiction over Laos was the last mission that could plausibly be described as offensive, that is, the pressure worth holding in mind. The men over the corridor were not fighting to win a war. They were fighting to hold the road open in reverse, to buy time for a departure that had already been decided in Washington, and to produce evidence that the departure was safe. The evidence had to come from somewhere. It came from the counting. The seasons decided the schedule. Rain closed the trail from roughly May to October, and the dry months from November to April were when the trucks ran and the hunting was done. The campaign that used the sensor system was called Commando Hunt. There were 7 of them between November 15, 1968 and March 29, 1972. The odd-numbered ones ran in the dry season and did the killing. Commando Hunt 5 from October 1970 through April 1971 was the largest of them by claimed results. The stated aim was never to close the trail. It was to make the North pay a price too heavy to bear, which is a very different objective, and one that cannot be measured except by counting. Into that campaign on the night of March 2, 1971, flew a Spectre gunship over the sector the Americans called Steel Tiger. Its pilot was Major Ed Holley. 13 men were aboard, which is what it took to run the guns, the sensors, and the fire control of a converted transport aircraft in combat. South Vietnamese forces were then pushing into Laos toward Chapone, and the corridor beneath them was busier and better defended than it had ever been. What follows comes from the men who were on board. The pilot, the navigator, and one of the sensor operators recounted long afterwards. It is testimony rather than official record, and I am flagging that, but it is the clearest surviving picture of the whole system working exactly as designed. They came on station and began working a section of road. Black Crow found ignition emissions under the canopy. The low-light television confirmed shapes, the fire control computer married sensor to gun, and the aircraft rolled into its left-hand turn. Trucks began to burn. They worked the road for under 3 hours. In that time, the crew reported 21 trucks destroyed and more left burning, or wrecked. Not one of those trucks had shown a light. Not one was visible to the naked eye from 5,000 feet. The system had reached into a jungle at night and pulled 36 vehicles out of it. Then the aircraft's warning equipment picked up the signal of a fire control radar, and the crew realized they were being tracked by a surface-to-air missile battery, which was not supposed to be there. Holly threw a 155,000-pound aircraft into a bank of roughly 135 degrees and dived at 4,000 feet per minute. A cargo aircraft is not stressed for that. The missile missed. When they landed and reported the launch, the intelligence staff did not believe them, because surface-to-air missiles were not supposed to be in that sector. The crew played the recording from the Black Crow system, and the staff believed them. Going back through the files afterwards, the navigator found a report filed a week earlier, noting that missile batteries had been moving into the Chepon area. Nobody had passed it on. Stack 21 trucks in under 3 hours from one aircraft in the dark. Under cloud, multiply that night across a season, and you get the number that broke the whole enterprise. Across Commando Hunt 5, the raw claims from aircrew totaled 16,266 trucks destroyed and around 7,700 damaged. 7th Air Force Headquarters in Saigon reviewed the claims and reduced them to roughly 11,000 destroyed and 8,000 damaged, which was still an enormous figure. The official Air Force historian Bernard Nolte later noted the awkward detail underneath it. At any given time, there were probably only 2,500 to 3,000 North Vietnamese trucks operating on the trail. The pattern held across the whole sequence. The first campaign, running from November 1968 to April 1969, claimed something over 7,000 trucks destroyed. The third, from November 1969 to April 1970, claimed 6,428 destroyed and 3,604 damaged, at a cost of around 60 American aircraft. The wet season campaigns in between produced no comparable totals because the trucks were not moving and there was nothing to count. The seventh and final campaign, ending in March 1972, claimed 10,689 trucks, of which the gunships were credited with 7,335. At its peak, that campaign was putting up something like 180 attack aircraft, more than a dozen fixed-wing gunships, and 21 heavy bomber sorties on a single day. That last figure is the honest one in the whole ledger, in the sense that it identifies which weapon was doing the work. A Defense Department review put the kill rates per sortie side by side. A gunship averaged 8.3 trucks per sortie, a lighter gunship type managed 3.3. A twin-engined bomber managed 2. A fast jet fighter, the aircraft type that flew the overwhelming majority of the sorties and absorbed the overwhelming majority of the cost, managed 0.3. The United States was flying hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties to achieve what a few dozen converted transport aircraft achieved almost incidentally, and it kept doing so for 4 more years. Across the 4 dry season campaigns, the Air Force reported approximately 46,000 trucks destroyed or damaged. Some accounts, drawing on Air Force intelligence, put the figure for all 7 campaigns at around 51,000 trucks, along with roughly 3,400 anti-aircraft guns. The North Vietnamese official history, covering the same 1970 to 1971 dry season, states that they lost about 4,000 trucks, of which 2,432 were destroyed by gunships. 16,000 claimed, 11,000 after review, 4,000 admitted. That gap is not a rounding error. That gap is the entire argument about what the campaign achieved. Meanwhile, the parachutes came down through the trees and men climbed up to fetch the silk, and the sensors kept transmitting and the computers kept counting, and every count went into a briefing and every briefing went to Washington, and in Washington the numbers were the war. The reckoning came from inside the American government, and it came in writing. The Central Intelligence Agency contested the truck figures from an early stage. As recounted by the Air Force historian Earl Tilford and the analyst John Carrell, the agency reported that Air Force claims exceeded by 6,000 the total number of trucks believed to exist in the whole of North Vietnam. Aircrews developed a joke about it. They referred to the great Laotian truck eater, a mythical beast that explained why daylight reconnaissance so rarely found the wreckage of vehicles destroyed the night before. A declassified agency study titled North Vietnam's Trucks and the War applied a deflation formula to the reported claims, counting 75% of vehicles reported destroyed and 25% of those reported damaged. Even after that discount, it found nearly 48,000 truck losses across the years 1965 to 1971, against an estimated total of 36,400 trucks imported into North Vietnam over the same period. Put plainly, by the American military's own numbers, discounted by American analysts, the imports came out roughly 1/4 below the losses. The North Vietnamese had been destroyed more thoroughly than they had ever been supplied. The study also noted that there was never any sign the North was short of trucks. The Defense Intelligence Agency reached the same wall by a different route. Air Force intelligence claimed 9,012 trucks destroyed in 1969. When the Defense Intelligence Agency ran its own more conservative model against the same period, it found that the enemy would have been reduced to 0 trucks on no fewer than 14 separate occasions. Bernard Nolte, writing the official Air Force history of the campaign, was equally direct about the parallel effort to count enemy dead from sensor data. The calculation, he wrote, rested on so many assumptions that the end product represented an exercise in metaphysics rather than mathematics. Earl Tilford's judgment cut at the culture rather than the arithmetic. Americans expected progress, he wrote, or at least quantifiable measures of success, and Commando Hunt provided the figures that satisfied that appetite. Productivity, he concluded, epitomized what the war had become, an exercise in management effectiveness. He recorded a 7th Air Force general briefed that more than 300 trucks had been destroyed the previous night, announcing to the room that what they had was the end of North Vietnam as a viable fighting power. The following night, the trail was as busy as it had ever been. It would be dishonest to leave it there, because not every historian accepts the ridicule. John Carrell pointed out that the North was importing 4,500 to 8,000 trucks a year, which makes the claims less absurd than they first appear, and argued that the agency's discount factor was itself arbitrary. The Air Force historian Eduard Mark, examining the figures later, found a rough correspondence between trucks imported and trucks claimed destroyed, and concluded cautiously that the claims were more plausible than their critics allowed. So I am not going to tell you exactly how many trucks were destroyed on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because nobody honestly can. The counting methods differed, the incentives were corrupt, and the archives disagree. What can be established is the throughput, and the throughput is what the war actually turned on. By 1971 and 1972, supplies reaching the South were increasing, not decreasing. In late 1971, Hanoi ordered 6,000 vehicles from the Soviet Union, double its usual annual order. American intelligence initially read that as proof the campaign was hurting. It was not. It was stockpiling. On March 30, 1972, the North Vietnamese army crossed into South Vietnam in the offensive, the Americans called the Easter Offensive. It was not an insurgency. It was armored, mechanized, conventional warfare, eventually involving as many as 14 divisions and more than 120,000 troops, supported by more than 200 tanks, by 130mm long-range artillery, by radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, and by shoulder-fired missiles carried by infantry. Every one of those vehicles had traveled the corridor. The censors watched. Brigadier General Richard Cross of the 7th Air Force put the conclusion into the record without evasion. The interdiction effort, he stated, failed to prevent the enemy from positioning sufficient supplies to initiate an all-out offensive against South Vietnam. Henry Kissinger's verdict on the original barrier concept was shorter. It was, he wrote, a splendid project on paper. Igloo White ended with the ceasefire in February 1973. The building at Nakhon Phanom went quiet. The computers were shut down. The sensors in the jungle ran out of battery and stopped talking, and the vines grew over them, and most of them are still there. Commander Paul Milius was promoted to captain while still carried as missing, a rank conferred on a man nobody could find. On April 26, 1978, 10 years after the parachutes came down, the Navy declared him presumed killed in action. He was awarded the Navy Cross for staying at the controls of a burning aircraft until 7 of his men were out. A guided missile destroyer carries his name and a motto chosen for what he did that day. It translates as "others before me." The squadron he flew for came home and was told to say nothing. Its men had flown a classified mission over a country the United States denied operating in aircraft that officially did not do that job, and there was no way to describe what they had done without describing the program. So they described nothing. Wives were not told. Reunions were awkward. The mission remained classified until 1998, 30 years after the losses. The Presidential Unit Citation for their work was awarded in May 2008, covering the period from November 1967 to July 1968. 40 years. Many of the men it honored were dead of old age before it arrived, and the 20 who were killed in Laos never knew there was anything to receive. Dong Si Nguyen, who ran the trail against them, outlived the war and the century. He rose to lieutenant general, joined the Politburo, served as a deputy prime minister of a unified Vietnam, and spent a long post-war career on infrastructure, which is exactly what he had been doing all along. He died in 2019 at 96 years old, a national figure in his own country and almost entirely unknown in the one that spent so much trying to defeat his road. The youth shot brigades who filled the craters have memorials in Vietnam and no reliable casualty figures anywhere. The Laotian villagers who lived beneath the corridor were never counted at all in any American accounting because they were never targets and therefore never entered the arithmetic, and the missing remained missing. Nearly 500 Americans are still unaccounted for in Laos. Since the mid-1980s, joint recovery teams have brought home the remains of more than 280 of them, one excavation at a time, from hillsides that no longer belong to anyone's war. The men who built the machine mostly did not talk about it either, but for a different reason. There was no defeat to explain to anyone. Nothing they were responsible for had broken. What went wrong several levels above the equipment, in a place none of them had access to. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is a highway now. Vietnam built a national road along much of its length and named it after the same man. Sections of the original route in Laos are hiking trails and off-road motorcycle routes run past craters that have filled with water and become ponds. The other legacy is under the soil. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos in roughly 580,000 bombing missions, which works out to a planar load of bombs every 8 minutes, around the clock, for 9 years. It made Laos the most heavily bombed country per person in history. More than 270 million cluster submunitions were dropped, and roughly 30% of them, about 80 million, failed to explode. They are still there. More than 20,000 people have been killed or maimed by them since the shooting stopped. Around a quarter of Laotian land remains contaminated, and only a small fraction has been cleared. American funding for clearance averaged around $2 million a year through the 1990s and early 2000s, rose to $19.5 million in 2017, and has since reached considerably higher figures. At current rates, the clearance of Laos is measured in generations. The technology, meanwhile, did not die. It graduated. Historians of military technology draw a line from Task Force Alpha to the modern battlefield. It is an argument rather than a paper trail, and worth labeling as one, but it is not a difficult argument to make. The assault breaker program of the 1970s and 1980s, designed to find and destroy Soviet armored columns deep behind the front, took the Igloo White concept and rebuilt it around radar. That program produced the airborne ground surveillance and battle management aircraft that flew over Iraq, tracking vehicles across desert in real time and passing them to strike aircraft. Unattended ground sensors returned to service in later conflicts, more capable, longer-lived, and better hidden than the darts dropped over Laos. They also came home. Sensor towers, ground radars, and remote monitoring systems developed for the trail migrated to border surveillance in the United States, a documented transfer from battlefield to boundary line. And the thing itself, the fusion of a distributed sensor field with a rapid strike capability, is now simply how war is fought. The armed drone loitering over a road, streaming to an operator who is somewhere else entirely, is Igloo White, with better cameras and a shorter kill chain. In Ukraine, both sides run networks of acoustic sensors, ground stations, cheap airborne eyes, and shared digital maps that route a detected vehicle to a weapon in minutes. Nakhon Phanom is now an application on a tablet, and there are thousands of them. Scholars of military technology date the automated battlefield to that building in Thailand, and they are right to. It was the first time anyone connected sensing, computing, and killing into a single continuous loop and let it run. Which brings us back to the thing that loop could never do. The United States built a machine that could hear a truck under a jungle canopy in the dark from a windowless room in another country, and it worked. What it could not do was tell anyone whether hearing the truck mattered. It produced a number every night, and the number was real, and the number was not the war. Dong Si Nguyen never needed to defeat the sensors. He needed to deliver a percentage of his cargo, and he did, and in the end, that percentage arrived in South Vietnam driving tanks. Paul Milius has never been found. He is one of the roughly 500 still unaccounted for in Laos. The destroyer that carries his name carries a motto taken from the last thing he did, which was to hold a burning aircraft steady until his crew were out, others before me. He died, placing a machine designed to hear a truck. It heard them. It heard tens of thousands of them, and it wrote the number down every night for 5 years, and the number was accurate, and the number was not an answer. That is the whole of it. The United States spent $1 billion a year learning that knowing where something is and being able to stop it are not the same problem. And it is a lesson that has to be relearned by somebody in every generation, usually at the same price.